drunk debates. We'll be doing dinner here in a little bit. But without further ado, Adam Hogan's talk on exploring the target exfiltration malware. So, enjoy.
All right. Thank you, Doctor. And thanks, everyone, for coming out to the talk. My name is Adam Hogan. I'm a consulting security engineer with, well, Cisco now. I've been with SourceFire for 5 years. We got acquired. So getting used to saying that. All right. Yeah. All right. What I want to do is talk about the target malware. And I want to do that as a way to, one, talk about how the attack happened, which honestly I don't want to spend a lot of time on. That was a lot fresher idea when the call for papers went out. Now we've all read Krebs, and a lot of that isn't new. But what I'd like to show then is sort of what we're able to learn about how the attack happened from looking at some malware dynamic analysis, right? So if you are to run some dynamic analysis on this malware, what would you learn from it? All right, what kind of data can we get from those tools, and how can we use that data? All right, and then ultimately, I'd like to put that together and say, okay, well, give you an idea of whether those type of tools can help you, right, back in your jobs and back in the real world. Is this going to be useful to your organization? Or at the very least, if you are looking at purchasing dynamic analysis tools for your company, what kind of questions should you be asking the vendors, right? So full disclosure, I have worked for SourceFire for the past 3 years. I'm an employee at Cisco now. The tools I use for this analysis are old stuff Cisco sells. I want to put that out up front just in the interest of full disclosure, right? This is not a sales pitch in any way. I use this tool because it's the tool I have, and they let me run it home, right? If I had another tool, I could redo the entire talk and come to the same conclusions. I'm not going to be talking about anything specific to this tool. I'm not even going to mention its name, right? So there's nothing in here unique to our tool, and this is in no way a sales pitch, okay? Target reach was big. It cost a lot. Everyone should be concerned. Nothing new in there to anyone in this room. But while I don't want to spend a lot of time on what it was and everything, let me at least specify that there were 3 important pieces of malware working in this campaign to get the data out of target, right? So there was the stuff that actually on the point of sale systems, sort of a drop spot in between to get data off of the cash registers in some place, and then the final get it out to the internet, right? There was a lot of press on the malware that ran on the point of sale systems. That was the scariest part, right? It was also the least innovative. This is just you swipe the credit card, but something reads the memory, right? It does a memory dump, looks for credit card numbers. This is in no way a new attack, right? This is something we've seen before. The FBI had been warning people about these types of attack for years, right? So there's nothing new there. And as much as journalists and marketing people wanted to talk about APT, there wasn't anything particularly advanced about that part of the attack, right? That second part of the malware was getting it off the cash registers and to another place, the idea that it would ultimately be able to talk out to the internet where they can get it, right? Because the point of sale systems don't have access to the internet, right? So that was basic PCI compliance, right? You can't have your cash registers connected to the internet. So instead, the malware they had to use these 3 different pieces of malware to collect it, right? Which, by the way, is what PCI compliance in and of itself gets you. Once you have signed off on your PCI compliance, it will take the hackers the couple extra hours to put together these other pieces of malware to get your stuff, right? That's what you get out of it. And then finally, once we have it on that middleware, once we have it on a system that's connected both to the point of sale systems and the internet, now we can finally take it off. That's where it moved completely out of Target's network and completely out of their control. All right, so let's take a look at the analysis here. Ooh, 1 second. Let me switch things around. All right. So first thing we do is run this through some automated analysis, right? The idea being we want to take a look at this malware, analyze it, come up with some indication to sign off, like, okay, if I've never seen this program before, can I tell if it's malware, right? And in this one, it was a definite gray area. When you're doing dynamic analysis of malware, there are some times where it's very, very obviously malware, right? If a program opens up a backdoor, it's pretty obviously malware. Keyloggers are very easy to pick out, because if you're loading a low-level keyboard DLL, that's not something most applications need, right? So some malware is very, very easy to say that, yep, that's malware. No problem there, let's block it. But a lot comes into a gray area, and this is one of them. This is not a program where dynamic analysis you could run through and it would say with any definitive answer, oh, this is definitely malware, well, let's start blocking it right away. It falls in that gray area. Now, there were some suspicious behaviors we can flag right away, and we'll go through them. Some of the obvious ones is that the binary included like packed or encrypted data. So whatever it was, someone was trying to hide something in this, right? They're trying to make it more and more difficult to analyze the file. It looked like it was trying to detect if it was in a virtual machine, right, which we're seeing more and more for malware, and something I'll talk more about. It's also using FTP, which not in and of itself malicious yet. We still allow FTP to exist. It's out there, but it's unusual, right? If you were to grab a random program, it probably doesn't use FTP. So these came through as not absolutely malicious, but suspicious. This is something kind of interesting, right? We also see that it spawns additional processes. So when you really dig into the analysis, there's a couple things you can do there. First, do some traditional static analysis of malware, right? What can we learn by looking at the binary just as, hey, let's read through this code. There's a couple things we can pick out of there. One was an IP address. So just doing like a regular strings analysis, right? If you ever looked at malware, one of the most basic things you start with is like the strings command, right? Anyone run strings command on a binary before? Right, so the idea is that you just use this program strings if it's built into nearly all Unix systems. All right, so you should have it on any build you've got. Run strings on a piece of malware, and it's going to come, well, here's the actual data strings in this process, which might tell you nothing, but oftentimes give you some clues as to what this program is trying to do. In this case, we saw an IP address hard-coded into that process, which at random doesn't mean anything to me. If you look it up, I mean, it's an IP address owned by Target, right? So again, we point to things that, like, if they had all this information, there would be clear indicators of compromise. There would be also breadcrumbs from them to follow as far as what this malware is doing, right? So this IP address was hard-coded in there. There's no reason for me to obfuscate anymore. This is all insanely public, but it's a habit, I guess. We know when the file was compiled, which on a case-by-case basis isn't interesting, but it's one of those tools that allow us to put together, like, okay, when we start to pick out variants of malware, which is newer, is this a change that we've seen to previous malware, and when was this put together, right? And then that's probably hard to read, but we also get a list of files it says it's going to import, right? Because a Windows program has to specify, okay, there's certain libraries I'm going to load from the operating system, right? So in this case, there's a few interesting ones we can learn about. For example, like we can see that it's going to spawn processes, right? Or at least it's loading the libraries to do so. I guess there's no reason to do it if you're not going to do it. You don't want to make assumptions with static analysis, but it gives you some idea of what the program's trying to do. So we know that this is loading the capabilities to spawn other processes, that it's loading the capabilities to write and create files, right? So at a glance of this list, assuming the hacker hasn't found a way to hide this information, which is easy, we'll get back to that. We'll have an idea what they're doing, because if you want to talk on the internet, you have to load those libraries, right? If you want to read or write files from the file system, you have to load those libraries. So it's a good hint at what the malware is trying to do. We can also look at the different sections. That's not a word. Sections that the malware has in it, right? So every Windows PE file has to have certain sections to it. We can take a look at what's in there. And one of the reasons you can do that is to actually, first of all, see what's in there, because there's a standard way to build a Windows file. If you don't have standard sections, it means someone's trying to hide something from static analysis, right? Which is a very, very common tool for malware authors to take. It's very easy to pack and encrypt a file so that static analysis won't tell you anything. Except that someone's trying to hide something from you, which is, of course, in and of itself kind of interesting. And we see some of that here, because one of the things we can do is actually measure, look at that, the entropy of each section. So it's a bit academic, but I want to mention it because it's out of all the data you get out of here, there's a lot where you have to look at it and put in some context and try and understand it. Entropy is one of the key areas where you can automate a lot of analysis. That was calculating the entropy score for a bunch of data is a math process that just spits out a number, and that tells you something. So this is one of those indications that you can take and try and automate as much as possible. That if you analyze a bunch of malware, now you can sort through it and will show me the high entropy ones, right? Now, all right, let me go back. What the hell is entropy, right? The idea here is let's measure how predictive this text is. That is, how random it is, right? And this all goes back to mathematical theory of communication, right? So if you've ever looked at encryption, if you've ever looked at how do you compress data to send it, it's very much a measure of energy. Is sort of a reverse engineering way of looking at, okay, how random is this data? How predictive is this data? So if you measure just random text, and so you measure the entropy of, say, random human text, the value is going to be about like 1.3. The idea is that each character of human language is worth about 1.3 bytes of information, right? Because each character isn't isolated, right? Q is always followed by U, right? C is very, very commonly followed by H, right? The human language is not random. So we can measure this sort of entropy. So just regular human language is going to be like a 1.3. Packed or encoded data will usually look like a 5, right? And MP3 will look like a 5, right? Video data will generally be like 5. It's a way that someone's done zipped files, right? They'll be a 4 or a 5. The idea being, okay, if we've compressed this, it's going to be that. Once we get into 6, now we're starting to look a little bit suspicious. It looks like it's random data. Of course, there's no reason to send out completely random data. So this usually means the malware's been encrypted in some way, right? So if you look at a file that's capable of encryption, that's been encrypted, it's going to near higher there. If you ever see it go into like the 7s, 8s, 9s, it's a dead giveaway that there's some encryption involved there, right? Which is one of the fastest ways to find CryptoLocker, because if you parse the code, the entropy score is going to come out in like 8s or 9s, right? It's very actively involved in encrypting. It itself is encrypted. There's a whole bunch of random nonsense in there. Some of the other strings we can pick out, we had the debug path still loaded in there, which not only told us that, okay, he's compiling with debug, which is very easy not to do. You can turn that off fairly easily. So he either doesn't know that or doesn't care to take the time to do it. My first assumption was like, oh, what an amateur, he didn't take out the debug symbols. But that is absolutely not fair. His attack worked. So who the hell am I to say that he's doing it wrong, right? It may have been a perfectly rational decision that says, screw it, right? So, but it also the path actually led to the author's handle here, Rescators, what it's able to follow because all the other variants included the same path. We're able to track different variants of this malware because they all have the same path in there. Also points, I mean, you start Googling around the author's name, you're going to track back to who actually wrote it, right? So kind of interesting there. We also found this string in there. It's a command, a move command, right? Move over file share, over a internal address. This directory is looking for this file, Twain, right, underscore 3 to a.dll, right? Which when we get into dynamic analysis, we'll have a lot more information on. But it's also a place to start. Just by running strings, we're picking out some interesting file names. Of course, something I want to go search for on other systems, right? All right, so instead, of course, that's all interesting, but how much can we learn from that? The idea is we also want to do dynamic analysis, right? So let's run the malware and see what it does. So now that we're actually running the malware, we can track it, right? So what changes does it make, right? What files does it touch? create, read? Is it downloading anything from the internet? Is it talking to anyone over the network? What does that look like, right? Everything now we can learn from instead of just making assumptions by doing static analysis, think, well, it has the capability to talk on the network. Well, let's run it and see what actually happens. Who would be talking to that, right? So it's kind of interesting that there were no files dropped, there were no files created, there were no files written to, even though we saw previously it loaded the capability of doing that, right? So it's sort of a red flag right away because it's going to tell you that, well, my dynamic analysis is not complete. Yeah, I ran this in a sandbox, but the malware is clearly not taking its full course. It loaded the capability to write files, hasn't bothered to do so, right? So already I'm falling short, and I know it, right? Now we can actually compare what DLLs were actually loaded. Static analysis will tell you, if the file was built like normal Windows files, what DLLs is it going to load? But to avoid static analysis, people who write malware are constantly trying to hide that. They'll bury it in the program, they'll pack it, they'll encrypt it, so you can't tell just by looking at it what DLLs will actually be loaded. By doing dynamic analysis, now you can say, okay, well, now we watched every file it touched. Now let's actually look at what DLLs were loaded, and we can compare that, which is another way of finding malware that has creatively hidden itself, right? Because they're trying to encrypt or pack that data so that static analysis can't see it. So if you say, well, my static analysis says this list of DLLs, if your dynamic list is different, now you have oftentimes found a new way that they're using to hide this data. And we know it didn't touch the registry. Of course, it's one of the key things we look at. Changes malware makes the registry isn't always the most interesting, but it's some of the easiest to follow up on, right? Because now you have an indicator of compromise. Well, I know it makes this change to the registry. Well, search the rest of my systems on the network. Show me who else have made this change, right? So not always the most provocative information, but again, you want to highlight those keys that not only tell you what the malware does, just for the sake of academic purpose of it's neat to see what malware does, but what else? What information can you take away and follow up on, right? And then as far as process management, we saw it create processes. So even dynamically, we watch it spin off these other processes, and we can dig into what those actually are. And we also said thread delays. So this process actually sleeps, which is not something a lot of legitimate programs do, right? Most applications you download, you run them for a purpose. To see an application that says, like, you know what, at this point in time, don't do anything for an hour. I don't know of a lot of legitimate programs that do that, but it's the easiest way malware authors can try and avoid this kind of dynamic analysis, right? The idea is, okay, if the blue teams are now looking at virtual machines analyzing malware, if they're running it in virtual environments, well, just go to sleep for an hour. How long are they going to spend watching one process, right? So it's sort of the easiest way to try and avoid virtual machine detection. It's not the only way. There's a lot now, but some I'll come back to. It was also something I had to learn the hard way. The first couple times I submitted this through my tools, it didn't tell me anything interesting except that we saw this sleep process. It wasn't until the next morning when I tried it again I got actual results. And if you look through the target malware, it's actually programmed not to run except during peak business hours, right? So it's actually not going to collect any of the credit card numbers except, like, what is it? I forget what it was, like 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. They'd be being, okay, it's Black Friday or whenever they were running this. No one is looking at anything closely, right? There's too much traffic, there's too much going on. So the first few times I tried this analysis didn't tell me anything interesting except that it was sleeping, which is in and of itself weird, right? If I hadn't been tired, I could have monkeyed with the system clock and the VM and done it, tried again. I just waited the next morning. I happened to find it then. Yeah.
Would it be a fair idea to set a script to, if it doesn't do anything, run it, wait an hour, still doesn't do anything, move the clock ahead, or something like that, or just try to run it every hour or something of that nature?
Yeah, it's a really good idea. Where it falls short is kind of depending on like how much malware you're looking at. If you have this stood up to be automated, the problem usually is that I have a queue of files waiting, right? So how long am I going to wait? Now, there are automated ways like, okay, let's restart it, but move the clock back a year. Let's see if anything different happens. let's move the clock ahead, let's see if anything different happens. So you can try those kind of things, but at the end of the day, all the tools are also looking at, well, how much time do you want to spend on one file?
Well, what I was thinking was if you set up a script so that it doesn't just run it once, it runs it, 24 times, once per hour, and it runs it at an accelerated clock. You literally get, 24 hours of testing in 15 minutes.
Right.
Is that something that's a functional idea, or is that wishful thinking?
No, it's absolutely possible, yeah. And it's certainly one of the ways we've looked at, trying to mess with this stuff, right? But we'll see a lot of different ways to do that VM detection as well. Yeah. But no, it's an excellent idea. All right, so it's creating these processes. Okay, what are they? So we actually see it run these commands. So we see it spins off, it runs cmd.exe, and we see what it's passing. So it actually runs this psexec command with the following argument. First of all, let's just accept the ULA. We want to automate this, right? So we're connecting to whatever box on the network. Here's the username and password it's using, right? So I think it's fairly well known and famous now that the attack began for that spear phishing campaign, right? The HVAC vendor, they got credentials from them in order to get their foot in the door. These are those credentials, right? So you can actually see what username it's using. There's the password, right? Backup $$R. And you see that it's trying to kill this process called bladelogic.exe. If you follow up on some of the later research, it wasn't actually BMC's BladeLogic. They had renamed their malware to be bladelogic.exe. So they knew Target was running this program called BladeLogic, right? And they knew the username, which had admin access, and they were able to find that password through that spear phishing campaign, right? So we see it running there. So essentially we have this malware continually trying to restart this process. Let's make sure our exfiltration process is constantly running. And then it does that periodically, and then we see it actually try to move another file. So it's looking to reach out here, reaching out to the cache register, and it's looking for this file here, Twain_32A DLL. That is, my clicker's dead. All right. So what we have is it's reaching out now to the cache register, grabbing the file. So every cache register system was grabbing the credit card numbers it was finding. It was storing them in a file called Twain_32 DLL. That's where it was storing them all. So again, another point we can follow up on. If we were getting these cache registers, that's the file we'd be looking for. If you found that file, it would be a text file full of track 1 and 2 data, right? Credit card number and everything else is embedded on the card. And we see it moving it to another server, and then it's going to call it data, and then a date stamp. So we knew exactly where it was going, where it was moving the files, and what they were going to look like, right? So if we were to find where it's moving these files, you would literally find a directory full of data _ different date stamps, and it would be all the credit card data it has collected from all the different infected point-of-sale systems. So we're able to follow the process management, which is actually a lot of extra work. If something's going to change something on the screen, why not take a screenshot of it? So we get this. So here's it actually running those cmd.exe commands. All right, so it wasn't trying to hide or anything. It knows it's running on a server. You won't see this, right? No one's watching this, the console. So it just pops up the window. Yeah, hey, I'm running these commands every now and then. We're also to see that it is trying to run some FTP traffic, right? So we see it reach out onto the network. It's looking for this IP, which is a target-owned IP, and it's trying to connect to FTP. So why not introduce a honeypot to this as well, right? If we're dynamically running this malware, if we have a honeypot process, now we can say, oh, you're trying to talk to that FTP server? I'm that FTP server. you know, like a liar. And now we can start to see, okay, well, what happens next, right? So we respond. Have a honeypot process respond. Oh, yeah, hey, I'm that IP. I am an FTP server, right? So it sends back the standard response. I'm a pure FTP server. And what comes next from the malware is the username and password. In fact, there we go. We've got this captured, so if we look at the packets, or just follow this TCP stream, we can pick all that out. So here's the actual session we're simulating, right? Yes, I'm an FTP server, and then it sends the username and password the malware authors had embedded in this, right? So now we actually have everything we wanted to follow up on this. If we're target, we can literally open up command prompt, FTP to that IP address. There's the username and password used to log in, and what you'd be looking at is hundreds, if not thousands, of files called data underscore some date stamp, and every one of them full of credit card numbers. And apparently, according to people who have worked on actually tracing back the malware's authorship, this also tells us something about the authors. Apparently, Crisis 1089, the password, some rallying cry for the Ukrainian revolution. A Ukrainian revolution. I don't know which one. Can't keep track. All right, so there's some more information we're able to gather by dynamically analyzing this process. All right, and we showed you that. I talked about sleeping. What we also saw on there was an IP scanner. There was a network scanner that had also been loaded on there by the attacker. And that one was actually a lot easier to analyze. It was very easy to pick out that one was malicious, because just looking through its text, it was pretty easy to identify it had been written in Russian. Right, there's Russian embedded in it. We saw that there's SQL code embedded in there. It does DNS lookups. It downloads files from the web. We saw all that. The PE file is actually sections with non-standard names, and it looks encrypted. So this is very easy to see. There's a UPX packing, right? Which is a very common, freely available packing tool to not encrypt, but obfuscate code, right? So that the static analysis is far more difficult. Of course, in the process, we see that it's UPX packed. So it's like, well, I don't see what they're hiding, but I know they're trying to hide something, right? And as an example, when you do this UPX packing, the entropy score on that came back as a 7.9, right? So again, another key indication when we're automating this process. Again, we want to look for those key points of data we can very easily highlight as a red flag, right? If the result is this, flag it for me. Because again, it's all going to come back to how much time we're going to spend looking at these results. So this is something I want to talk about in more detail, right? Yeah?
Is the static analysis capabilities, are they impacted by language type? I know sometimes if it's not, specified, it does have issues with some facts. Cause a lot of static code to blow up.
Oh, I suppose if you were getting, like, if you were getting weird Unicode characters, I think a lot of like traditional static analysis tools might choke on that, right? If you're just running strings, I don't think it would know how to it would know how to display kanji, right? That might tell you something, right? And as far as what strings are embedded in there, it might be stuff you don't even realize is language if you don't know other languages. So quite possibly, yeah. All right. So what are we getting out of this, right? What are we learning? Because I'd like to come back around to, okay, well, how useful is this, and where should we really see tools like this being used? So we learn about the file's behavior. The ultimate goal is, okay, is this malware? And in this case, maybe, right? Because what vendors are trying to do is get this so automated. It's like, oh, you don't have to do anything, right? Just run malware through this, and it will determine if it's malware or not. And this is one case where that's not going to work. We come back as a very gray area. This is kind of suspicious looking, but we're not willing to say if it's malware or not, right? So what else are we learning about kind of its behavior and hopefully some indicators of compromise, right? We know that it's trying to talk to these FTP servers. So let's maybe look back to the network log, see who else is trying to connect to that FTP server, right? We know that it's looking for that certain, 20_32 DLL file. Well, let's search our environment for that, right? So hopefully we're getting other points of data we can use. Another huge benefit if it's very easy to use, right? So we're doing malware analysis without having to load up IDA, without having to do reverse engineering, without having to learn assembly, right? Which, I mean, I've done in the past, right? And I used to teach like a reverse engineering or a course where we go through, okay, here's how assembly works and all that. I haven't done that in a couple years and probably couldn't do any of it anymore, right? That is a difficult skill, and if you're not looking at assembly every day, it's absolutely something's going to fade right out of memory, right? So now we can do this sort of analysis, easy to use, and it's going to take less time, right? Ultimate question a lot of people are trying to ask, though, is can we ignore it, right? Can the appliance be set and forget, right? Because it's certainly what people are trying to sell you. What we're trying to sell you. It might not be totally honest to say that. Right. Yeah, so you want to take good IOCs and move them out elsewhere, right? Where else can I look for them, right? But I'm also not going to talk about that because it would get into product specifics, and I'm not going to do that, right? And if we can ignore it, I mean, should you, right? So why does this happen? Vendors have been pushed to focus on detection for the purpose of automated blocking. And that last caveat is actually really important, right? The goal is not, right, what vendors are doing. They're not trying to say, okay, what's the best way to detect malware? Instead, it's what's the best way to detect malware quickly, without impacting traffic or production or anything, without inconveniencing everyone, in a way that I can utilize automatically, right? And this has been the case since Gartner came out with their report and said IDS is dead, right? It's detecting malware, but it's not stopping anything, so it's completely useless. Which, like most things we hear from analysts like that, has a kernel of truth, right? But it's also pushed people to the point where it's like, okay, well, if you can't detect it on the wire at line speed, it's no good, right? So no one's thinking about, okay, well, what else can we do? There's a good role for these kind of dynamic analysis tools, right? There's the 100 different ways you can hide code in a PDF file is insane. And it's not something an IPS can pick up on, right? You'd have to reassemble the file and understand how a PDF works and then execute it. It can't be done at line speed. So we're having a chance to do that, right? But there's other issues with it, right? We're now seeing malware come back and say, well, let's stop from being detected in a virtual machine like this, right? Let's stop dynamic analysis from working. And just like talking to our security researchers, we're seeing upward of 60% of malware has some way to avoid the sort of dynamic analysis detection, to see if it's in a virtual machine or not, right? A lot of that's the cheap ways, like, okay, just sleep for a while, or only work for certain times of days, right? But we're all seeing a lot more interesting stuff. We've seen where malware has looked to see if the mouse is moving. Of course, if it's in a console that's completely automated, right, mouse isn't moving. Well, okay, we want our sandbox to work, so go make the mouse move. Then we saw malware measure the entropy of mouse movement to see if it looked like an automated process or not, or was an actual human movement, right? So again, like everything else in malware, there's an arms race there, right? We'll always go back and forth. So a lot of malware falls into a gray area, and then the question becomes, who's going to make the call? Because the system is going to come back with some stuff like, okay, this is definitely malware, we should block it. These are definitely good, let's not block them. And there's a big old middle here. Okay? So if you're looking at these kind of security tools, at the end of the day, the things you need to consider are, one, the automated block rate, which are very well publicized, right? You can find these vendor bake-offs. You can look at like the NSS Labs breach detection report, and they're trying to detect all that stuff. But no one's really looking at the second part. Right? What's the process for what can't be automated? No one's bothered to measure that, right? So the question becomes, what's the right tool for the job, and is this really going to help out your organization? All right. So quick step back to Econ 101, which just want to say that productivity comes from labor mixed with capital, right? The idea is there's some idea of, the capital is tools you use to make yourself more productive, right? I'm not getting pedantic just to bore you with overly academic nitpicking. That's just a bonus. But my graduate degrees are in economics, so suck it. All right, so when do we use a tool? So if some vendors got a tool, they're trying to sell it to you. When are you going to use it? Well, when is a tool more appropriate? So at its fundamental economic level, cost is the primary factor, right? A few months back, we saw a lot of protests for fast food workers, right? From go on strike and say, hey, there needs to be a $15 minimum wage. Where's my other picture? I screwed up my slides. This is what I get for getting bored on a plane and playing with, the animations, because I got that much time to kill. All right, damn it. Anyway, the picture that's flying by is a kiosk in a Taco Bell KFC/KFC, right? Sometimes they combine them, where you can walk right up to it, hit the little touch screen, order your food, slide your credit card, and then someone just bring it out to the counter, right? We're seeing these introduced. Hey, just a short while after all these threats to strike. Not a coincidence, right? When I was in high school, the minimum wage went up, and a couple months later, Meijer had self-checkout machines, right? Labor and capital are substitutes, right? You can use one or the other, and cost is going to end up determining what you're going to do. Now, the reason that's so relevant in information security is if you haven't seen it, we have record low unemployment rates in information security, right? So the Bureau of Labor Statistics measures unemployment rates, and they do it by job sector. And they have never, in any other field, seen a sustained 0% unemployment rate as long as they have in information security, right? That's insane. And like most government numbers, it's also wrong. Because they have, they have no way of measuring negative unemployment. The assumption is that if there's zero unemployment, right, then the number of jobs equals the number of workers. But that very well might not be the case, right? There might be pent-up demand. There might actually be more jobs out there than people, right? So there's no way, that measure doesn't include the possibility that there's actual shortage in information security people, right? So, if, relatively speaking, supply is being outpaced by demand, right, that leads to an increase in price. The increase in price of labor is your salary, by the way. So good news, your salary should be going up, right? Your salary going up is also going to make your employer think about, well, how do we replace him with a tool, right? And that's a bad way of phrasing it. That's a very provocative way of phrasing it. Of course, it's not replace you. It's, help you in your work, right? Because enhance. So, well, I mean, that's a real question, right? Can all your security people be completely replaced by the right tool, right? What can be automated? So the automation, I think we have to look at, fundamentally it's going to come down to like complexity and creativity, right? So the standard example is always like, Ford's assembly line, right? It's a very simple task. You can explain to someone very easily, okay, just put this piece here, bolt it on, whatever it is. That can be automated. Maybe not with a surgeon's job. Right? It's a little more complex. Getting that automated is going to take substantially smarter robots, right? And of course, if there's any creativity involved in the process, it's not at all something we can automate, right? So you can't replace Mr. Ross with a robot, right? If you just want to reprint the same painting over and over again, of course you can. If you want a new painting, we can't necessarily automate that yet, possibly singularity, blah, blah, blah. But right. If you want happy little trees that no one's ever seen before, you need a person. So can security be automated? right? And I would say that there's degrees of that, and then at the end of the day, I'd say no. I mean, there's always like parts of it, but that's never going to replace the need to have people, right? Sure, we don't need someone to sit down and manually inspect every packet going into your network to see if it's going to an allowed port. Firewall automates that part. That's a standard kind of, yeah, question? Depends on the life cycle of the threat. Sorry, the question was if can security be automated if the attack is automated? I would say it depends on the life cycle of the attack, right? If there's one attack and it is automated, well, I can block that one attack as soon as I learn about it, right? But attackers know that, and there's a dynamic response there. If their attack is being automatically blocked, they move on to something new, right? So in the short term, yes. In the long term, no. Sure.
Be able to look at false positives, but you can't rate false negatives. That hands-on creativity that you have there is going to help you identify the false negatives that tool misses.
Yes.
Like we're talking about automating tools, hanging up on acrylic language.
Right.
Well, a tool might like, oh, it's not outputting anything that I understand, so it's probably not a valid trigger that can research.
Right.
Whereas a human will look at me like, that's something that I need to look into more, and why do I see kanji instead of, something else.
Right. Could everyone hear that? To summarize, there will always be weird shit, and people need to look at it.
Well said.
Mhm. Yes, it is. It is very difficult. And at no point should you ever like finish up your dynamic analysis and be like, I understand this malware. I know everything it's going to do. You don't, right? Unless you really decompile it, get back to the source code, you don't understand everything it's going to do. We're trying to speed this up, right? So you're absolutely right. You shouldn't make any assumptions that you know what's going on. The idea here is that we don't have enough people who can reverse engineer. So how much can we automate? To that end, you sort of, it's not like I want to understand everything about this program. I want to understand just enough that I can get to an indicator of compromise I can follow up on, right?
Well, I think that's the big point, too, of the runtime analysis desire. And, a lot of this is offline or not real time, or runtime, I should say. And that kind of illustrates what's going on in the Verizon DVR.
Mm-hmm.
They show that the graph that shows time to detection versus time to compromise and exploit. So we have to close that gap because it might take, how long does it take for them to go through the whole analysis once they realize it's a problem? Well, at that point, then they could have already expelled everybody and been looking at stuff on Facebook.
Yeah.
There was a breach.
Right. Yeah, so the goal is driving, right, so should you have a SAM, should you have dynamic analysis, you should be doing that in your environment. And if you give that doctor his MRI machine to one of Ford's assembly line workers, he's not going to be that productive with it, right? So the ultimate advice I would point out is that you need smart people to use the tools, right? That's the advice I'll give to people asking, okay, do I need this tool or not? And I think, note the caveat that can use it. It's not enough just to have smart people, right? So I'll talk to people like, you need smart people that can use the tool if it's going to be useful. Which sounds really simplistic when I say it like that, but this is a lot of people aren't thinking about it.
I think you have to understand the tool.
Yeah.
What's going on.
and be able to use it, right? So the thing I see a lot is that, like, say, well, oh yeah, we got all kinds of smart people, right? I got these guys here, I got these guys working for me, they're really smart. And most of the time I'll look at it and say, well, yeah, they're also working 80 hours a week already, right? When are they going to use this tool, right? Are they actually going to be able to make any use of this? Or are they spending all their time in project management meetings instead of doing this, right? So yeah, okay, you've got that guy over there, and he's a genius, but he's also like one bad day or 2 extra Red Bulls away from blowing a gasket and losing his mind. So are you going to pile more work on him, right? So you have smart people that can use it. Right? You had a question?
I was just going to say smart people with the time, resources, and context.
Yes. Yeah. That's more succinct. I completely compressed yours down, yeah. So it works the other way too. Not everyone's geared for brevity, all right? So we're in an arms race with people writing malware, right? And I used to say that arms race is a good metaphor, and now I don't, because it's not a metaphor. It's a little arms race. They're attacking us, right? And if we think about an arms race, you have to think about that's a never-ending process, right? You develop a better shield, I'm going to go back, come up with a bigger weapon, right? And it's something else I've lectured on. I don't want to get too deep into that, oh God, for the pun, rabbit hole. But one of the things that I've really learned about how malware is growing is looking at parasitology, right? Because if you look into biology and say, okay, well, how do parasites evolve with their host? Will actually tell you a lot about how malware is changing over the years, right? So I don't want to talk a lot about it. Well, I'm running out of time for one thing. But it is a complex job, right? That arms race process means it will always be a complex job. It does require creativity because there will always be new weird shit, right? So we can't be fully automated. These tools aren't here to replace you. They're here to help you, right? So at the end of the day, it comes down to, okay, well, is this tool something I can completely automate, or do I have people with the intelligence resources and such to make use of them, right? The key component of that being, right, if you're not evolving, you're dying, right? And that's, sorry, that's the Red Queen logo. I was trying to speed through that. But in the Alice in Wonderland, so when they explained that, when Alice is talking with the Red Queen, that is saying, okay, we have to run very fast to stay in the same place. And that's what happens when you're in an evolutionary process, right? Yeah. Because the malware is always trying to attack you, to stay in your same relative position, right? If I want to stay relatively, if I'm relatively safe today, if I want to be relatively safe tomorrow, I need to keep up, right? If you're standing still, you're getting worse because the attacker is moving forward. So if you're not evolving, you're dying, or in this case, you're not, learning, you're dying, right? So, any managers in the audience? Okay. Not a lot. Well, one thing I continually tell managers is that if you want to change your teams, then the one thing you can do is remember that your most important job is to keep your smart people out of meetings. Yeah, right. You have to keep doing security just to stay good at it, right? It's not like okay, hey, I learned security, I'm done. Yeah, it's like, whew, all right, well, I can do this for 20 years, right? Yeah, well, all right. That's you can always move to auditing, I guess, sure. That's but you have to keep that in a way, right? So you have to keep learning to even stay relevant, right? By the way, technology is not the only way. I'm not saying that to move ahead to continually evolve, you have to learn new hacking techniques, all right? Frankly, there is a huge market for managers who understand security. Like a manager that could actually manage other hackers, right? If you wanted a bunch of bright security people, not always the easiest cats to herd. There's an enormous market for someone who has the managerial skills to put together a team of bright security people. It's not always the easiest job. All right, so is it right for your organization? Again, the questions you want to ask are how much can you automate? Right? And a lot of that comes down to the tool. If you're evaluating a tool, if you're looking at a vendor's tool, then it's like, okay, well, how much can? Is this going to be automated? And then the flip side of that, how much can it help your analysts? And are you trying to replace people, or are you trying to help them? Because that's going to come back to, well, what people are you trying to help? What's their job, and what can they do with the tool? All right, so you're going to have to go back to them. You're going to have to back to them and say, okay, well, how would this help you? How would this speed up your job? How would this change it for you, right? So it's that process, mixing labor and capital, right? It's not always just plugging in a box that blinks and, hey, we have security. A lot of times it comes down to it's a tool to help someone else do their job better or faster or easier, whatever the case may be, which is ultimately a question of people. All right, so thanks everyone for coming. I'll certainly stick around for whatever questions, but I believe, at least by their clock, they'll probably want to start tearing down the room and everything, so I'll at least want to get off of here, but if you have any questions, I'll stick around for a while, all right? Thanks.